rise today, as we always are here on the territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation. To them we say miigwech. We're here tonight to debate Bill C-47. Bill C-47 is not the budget. The budget is a different document, and it's related, of course, but Bill C-47 are those legislative changes that are necessary in order to have the measures in the budget, not all of them, but some of them, move ahead. The measures in the budget that are simply allocations of funds that don't require legislative changes, you will not find in Bill C-47. So I find myself strangely in the position, having studied C-47, of thinking I might vote for it, even though I could not possibly vote for the government budget. The budget has much in it that I couldn't support. Increased subsidies to fossil fuels disguised as carbon capture and storage. The use of fossil fuels to create hydrogen, thus taking what should be a green fuel and making it a fossil fuel source again. But the Budget Implementation Act is not that. Let me go over what it is. It's 429 pages in 4 parts. The longest part, Part 4, has 39 different divisions. They are wide-ranging and cover many different things. In that, let me confirm that this is an omnibus bill, but it is not an illegitimate omnibus bill. It is nothing like Bill C-38 of spring 2012, when the previous administration under Stephen Harper destroyed 70 different acts in one bill with changes that had not been forecast in the budget. That was an illegitimate omnibus bill. This one is a reasonable omnibus bill because in order to implement the budget, multiple things need to be changed. For instance, Part 1 of this very long bill deals with the Income Tax Act and such things as creating a deduction for tradesmen's tools. Everything also then to going on to divorced and separated parents can open up a joint registered educational savings plan for their children. Such things as we've heard about related to the new program to cover dental care, changing the tax rules so that CRA can disclose personal information about Canadians so that they can get their dental care. Part 3 deals with air traveler security changes. I could go on and on because it's 429 pages. By Division 39, at the end of the bill, we have changes to the Canada Elections Act to deal with the protection of personal information. This is a wide-ranging bill. It even touches foreign policy. At Division 5 of Part 4, we remove, this is good, I think Conservatives would want to vote for this too, removes Russia and Belarus from most favored nation tariff treatment. I want to devote the time I have remaining to talking about one of the longer sections which relates to issues I've been working on for years and some of which I was ecstatic to see. This deals with Division 21, Oceans Protection Plan. Now, the budget itself has 2 references to our oceans. They're both found on page 135, and they're remarkably brief. One says we are going to protect Canada's whales. Now, this is basically a dressed-up repackaging of new money to departments, Fisheries and Oceans, Transport Canada, Environment Canada, Parks Canada, for what the budget claims will be continuing to protect endangered whales and their habitats. That's just fine and dandy, but that's not in the Budget Implementation Act, which is just as well, because I've rarely been as furious or disillusioned or angry. Je suis absolument bouleversé par la décision.
I'm completely shaken by the decision of this government when they approved that project on April 20th. This project puts further stress on a certain species.
They approved a disastrous project that likely spells the extinction of the southern resident killer whale, our Chinook salmon, Fraser River Chinook, of numerous other species, including the western sandpiper. It's a project called Roberts Bank on the Fraser River estuary, and it will result in basically covering in concrete over 70% of that floodplain habitat. It's an outrage. But it's not in the Budget Implementation Act. But it puts the lie to the budget is going to have a section that protects whales. Right. Hypocrisy writ large. I see other friends from British Columbia nodding. We know this is an outrage. But the next part of the budget that deals with oceans is, I think, where we see most of the over 60 pages in the Budget Implementation Act for what's called the division that deals with the Oceans Protection Plan. Now, that probably relates to this one line item, cleaner, healthier ports. So they report that what we're going to do, Budget 2023 proposes to provide $165 million over 7 years to establish green shipping corridor program, reduce the impact of marine shipping and surrounding ecosystems, and there's more to it. Now, what do we find in the Budget Implementation Act, and how is it relevant to what I just read? Well, I have to say, there's a lot in here that is just playing catch-up with times passing. This bill deals with things such as oil source pollution. So where there is pollution caused by a vessel, we are increasing how much the oil, the shipper might have to pay, the owner of the ship. I don't think it's enough, by the way. It moves from, in what's the Marine Liability Act that's already on the books, it moves from saying, in the case, believe it or not, in respect of claims for loss of life or personal injury, it was a $1 million limit. This Budget Implementation Act moves it to a $1.5 million limit, and so on. That's one specific area. Another specific area that I mentioned briefly because I really think it's important, at page 241 of the Budget Implementation Act, we have a section that says, under the Marine Liability Act, in terms of costs that the vessel owner and company must be responsible for, under the Hazardous and Noxious Substances Convention, they will now be required to compensate Indigenous peoples for economic loss in relation to hunting, fishing, trapping, or harvesting rights under Section 35 of the Constitution. So a better recognition of Indigenous rights. There's much here, but I do want to concentrate on what was, for me, what I've been hoping for some years. Ironically, about a week before the Budget Implementation Act came out, I wrote to the Ministers of Finance, Transport, Fisheries and Oceans, and Environment Canada saying, are we ever going to see any measures to implement the Wrecked, Abandoned, or Hazardous Vessels Act? Are we ever going to see the promised Vessel Remediation Fund? Is it going to be in the Budget Implementation Act? Surprise, it is. So it's found at Section 430, page 277. For anyone reading the Budget Implementation Act at home, I have to wonder about your life if you're reading the Budget Implementation Act at home, especially if you're reading it out loud to your children. It will certainly put anyone to sleep. But it's very exciting because we passed the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessels Act 4 years ago, March of 2019. And we were excited in that day that we got it done. Most people here who don't live in coastal areas won't know what a hazard it is to have an abandoned vessel. Somebody's old sailboat, they're fiberglass. And if somebody owns them and they're moored in your harbor, they're moored in your navigational lanes, getting rid of them is really hard. Now, if you live in Atlantic Canada, it's not so hard because over the course of the winter, any abandoned boat will be smashed to bits and gone by spring. But if you live along the coast of the Salish Sea, if you live along the British Columbia's coast, they're there almost forever. And in a time where we have the horror of people who are inadequately housed, many people who are homeless will move on to these vessels and live there. They are unsafe. Once we got the act passed, we thought we'd solve the problem. But then the government refused to act. So I have constituents who say, well, there's an abandoned vessel. Will you do something? And the Coast Guard and then DFO and Transport Canada all pass the buck and don't move the vessel. The problem was they don't have the money, they say. So now we have this new fund. Details will come out on how it's going to work in regulations. But I couldn't be more pleased that we now have a vessel remediation fund and additional powers to the Minister of Transport. There are other related measures in Bill C-33, which we have not yet debated in this place, but maybe, just maybe, the Budget Implementation Act, at long last, allows us to implement the Wrecked, Abandoned, and Hazardous Vessels Act. And with that, Madam Speaker, I will close.